December 8th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Oahu. First light comes in pale and wrong, the kind of dawn that should smell like salt and breakfast coffee, but instead reeks of fuel oil, burned paint, and hot metal that never cooled overnight. The water is a slick mirror broken by floating debris, splintered planks, life jackets, shattered boat davits, and beneath it, the harbor is still alive with trapped air hissing from ruptured compartments, like a ship trying to breathe through crushed ribs. On Ford Island, Seaman First Class Joseph Joe Martinez, an eager young diver's tender who'd never imagined his first real job would be inside a grave, watches the salvage men gather near the waterline with their boots already black from stepping through oil that clings like syrup. Above them, battleship silhouettes look unreal in the morning haze. Arizona is a burned-out ruin, still smoking in places. Oklahoma lies capsized, her red bottom exposed to the sky like a wound. West Virginia has settled into mud with her superstructure scorched. California sits low and sullen, slowly flooding itself into a sinking that feels deliberate, like exhaustion. Somewhere nearby, a hammer rings, one clean metallic strike, followed by another, because even after a day that broke the world, the Navy's first instinct is to make steel answer again. Commander Homer N. Wallen, the man who will soon be charged with turning wrecks back into warships, walks the line of devastation with a notebook in hand, his eyes moving like a surgeon's. Bulkhead damage, flooded voids, fire-warped deck plates, twisted cranes, snapped pipes, unexploded ordnance that might still be lurking under the surface. He doesn't talk like a hero, because salvage is not heroic in the usual way. Salvage is arithmetic, physics, and nerve performed in a place that wants you dead. A launch sputters past, its wake cutting through oil rainbow, and the men aboard point toward the dry docks, as if the docks are a promise. If you can get ships into those docks, if you can patch holes and pump compartments and restore enough buoyancy, you can claw them back from the mud. But the harbor is littered with problems that don't care about willpower. Mangled steel that blocks access, flooded magazines that could still explode, toxic fumes trapped in spaces where a diver might take one breath and never take another. The divers suit up anyway because there is no alternative. The Pacific Fleet can't wait for perfect conditions, and Japan believes those battleships are out of the war for good. Joe watches a diver, face hidden behind a mask, hose trailing like an umbilical cord, step down the ladder into the water, and the surface swallows him without ceremony. The diver's boots disappear into blackness so thick it looks solid, and for a second Joe imagines the bottom is just oil and mud and wreckage, until he remembers there are men down there too, trapped, drowned, burned, still inside compartments where the metal is warm to the touch. The diver's voice crackles over the line, muffled and distant, reporting what he can feel more than see. Jagged edges, loose cables, debris fields like underwater barbed wire. He finds a hatch that won't open, a passage blocked by collapsed structure, and he taps 3 hard knocks against steel that answers with a dull, heartbreaking emptiness. On the surface, the salvage team begins the slow work of turning chaos into a plan. They mark openings, rig pumps, prepare patches, grate steel plates and wooden plugs, and rubber gaskets that will be bolted or welded over torn hull seams. They talk about cofferdams, temporary watertight enclosures built around damaged areas so men can work dry where the ocean insists on flooding everything. They talk about blowing down compartments with compressed air, about sealing ventilation trunks, about isolating electrical systems so a stray current doesn't kill a diver in an instant. Every sentence is technical, but every sentence is also a refusal to accept the word sunk as final. Across the harbor, the battleship Nevada, the one ship that tried to run the gauntlet during the attack, sits wounded and grounded, her path a reminder that survival itself can be forced into a humiliating choice: beach the ship or lose her in the channel and block the whole base. On Ford Island's edge, welders start cutting through twisted metal. Each torch flare sounds like a snarl. Each shower of sparks, a little artificial sunrise that briefly makes the blackened masts look alive again. The salvage crews are not merely repairing hulls, they are unknotting the port itself, clearing berths, restoring cranes, rebuilding utilities, because a harbour is a machine and every broken piece slows the entire war effort. Joe feels the weight of that truth when Wallen stops near the capsized Oklahoma and stares at the exposed hull, silent for a long moment. Right now, that ship is too big, too broken, too full of death to save in any clean way. Yet even here, even with a battleship upside down, the salvage mind is already thinking in steps. Stabilize, recover what you can, prevent further sinking, salvage systems, then, later, attempt the impossible. Behind them, the air raid siren wails suddenly, sharp enough to tighten every spine, and men glance up at the sky with an instinctive anger, because the work they're doing requires calm hands and patient hours, and the enemy has already proven it can turn calm into hell in minutes. The siren dies away without another attack, but it leaves a residue. This isn't a repair job in peacetime. This is surgery under threat, with the patient bleeding and the knife still somewhere in the room. As the morning stretches into afternoon, the divers keep going down, coming up coughing oil-tainted water, swapping out tanks and hoses, reporting new damage, new hazards, and occasional small victories. A valve found and shut, a compartment sealed, a pump line secured. Those are the first stitches in a wound the world assumes can't be closed. And when Joe looks out across the harbor again, past the smoke and the wreckage, he realizes the real battle has already begun. Not the one fought with bombs, but the one fought with wrenches, welding torches, patch plates, and men willing to climb into black water where the dead still drift. Because somewhere in all that mud and twisted steel is the future of the fleet. And if the salvage crews can bring sunk ships back to life, Japan's first great victory will start turning into a mistake. December 10th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. 3 days after the attack, the harbor is no longer a battlefield of explosions, but a battlefield of minutes, because oil still seeps from torn tanks, rainwater keeps finding holes in shattered decks, and every hour a ship sits flooded is another hour corrosion and silk claim wiring, turbines, switchboards, and the delicate muscles that make steel move. Joe Martinez watches Commander Homer N. Wallen's salvage team split the wreckage into problems small enough to solve. First stop the bleeding, then give the ship back its breath, then rebuild what the water has murdered. The divers go down in pairs now, tenders paying out air hose and lifeline hand over hand as if they're lowering men into a mine, and the first task is brutally simple. Find the holes. On USS West Virginia, the torpedo damage along the port side is a torn, jagged story written in bent shell plating. And down there, the diver's gloved hands become his eyes, tracing sharp edges, feeling where frames are buckled, where rivets have snapped, where a seam has opened wide enough to swallow a fist. Above the surface, shipfitters and welders build the answer in sections, patch plates cut to shape, timber shoring, rubber gaskets, bolts and studs, and in some places cofferdams, temporary watertight boxes braced against the hull, so men can create a dry working space in a harbor that refuses dryness. The language is technical, but the emotion is raw. Every patch is a statement that sunk is not a verdict, only a condition. The work is filthy and dangerous in ways combat footage never shows. A diver swims into a compartment and the beam of his lamp hits a curtain of black oil so thick it eats light. He bumps a dangling cable and it swings like a snake. He feels heat still trapped in twisted metal, the slow warmth of a ship that burned from the inside. He reaches a valve wheel crusted with grime, forces it shut, and hears the faint change in flow that means a flooding path has been cut off. On USS California, the problem is different, but just as unforgiving. She sits low, flooded not only from torpedo damage but from uncontrolled water ingress and the slow drowning of spaces that should have been sealed. Salvage men talk about dewatering as if it's a single action, but Joe learns it's a campaign.
Pump out one compartment and water finds its way back through a ruptured pipe, a blown gland seal, a forgotten scuttle. Seal one hatch and fumes build in another space until a man's head swims and he has to be hauled out before he collapses. So the teams establish a rhythm that feels like wartime surgery. Divers mark and seal openings, topside crews rig pumps and hoses, electricians isolate circuits and run temporary power where they can, and engineers begin the quiet, meticulous work of preserving what hasn't yet been ruined, lubricating machinery, flushing systems, draining and cleaning tanks, because the sea doesn't just sink a ship, it contaminates it. Every action is constrained by the harbor itself. Docks and cranes are damaged, channels are cluttered, and the Navy Yard must keep operating even while it repairs itself, which means barges become workshops and improvised staging platforms, and men eat standing up with oil on their hands because taking gloves off feels like losing time. The salvage crews also fight a second enemy: unexploded ordnance and unstable wreckage. A patch plate can't be welded safely if a pocket of fuel vapor is trapped behind it, and a diver can't work confidently when a fallen mast or collapsed bulkhead could shift in the mud with one wrong touch. The only protection is procedure and trust, the kind that forms when you've watched a man feed out your lifeline, and you know he'll haul you back no matter how long you're down. At night, the harbor looks even stranger. Spotlights sweep across black water, guards watch for a second raid, and welding torches throw harsh white arcs against the pens and dock walls, making the salvage work look like a city rebuilding itself under siege. In the distance, the capsized USS Oklahoma still lies belly up, too massive and too tragic to be fixed quickly. But even there, the Navy's mindset refuses to stop. Teams plan how to strip what can be salvaged, how to recover guns and equipment, how to keep her from obstructing operations, and someday, though not soon, how to right a ship that looks beyond hope. Wallen's men triage the harbor the way a battlefield medic triages bodies. The ships that can be returned fastest get priority, the ones that are total losses become salvage sources, and the ones that are too complex are stabilized and put into a longer plan. It isn't sentiment, it's tempo, because the United States is already counting hulls, and Japan is already assuming those hulls are gone. Joe hears the older men speak in a new tone. Less grief now, more hard focus. Because every patch, every pump started, every compartment made watertight is a small reversal of December 7th, a quiet theft of victory back from the enemy. And in the middle of this mechanical war, human moments still punch through. A diver surfaces shaking, pulls his mask off, and spits black oil, saying he found a passage blocked by wreckage where the air still tasted faintly of smoke. A shipfitter pauses over a twisted ladder and mutters the name of a friend. An officer reads a list of recovered bodies with his jaw clenched, then turns and gives orders, like the list didn't just hollow him out. By the end of the week, the harbor is still scarred, but it's no longer paralyzed. The oil fires are controlled, channels are being cleared, pumps are running day and night, and the idea that the fleet is permanently crippled starts to look less like fact and more like wishful enemy math. The impossible isn't one dramatic lift yet. It's this: men in mud and oil creating buoyancy out of wreckage, sealing holes you can't see, pumping out water that keeps coming back, rebuilding systems under threat, and doing it fast enough that the Pacific Fleet's wounds begin to close before Japan expects them to. Because the real miracle of Pearl Harbor salvage starts here, in the dark under a battleship's belly, where a diver's hands find a torn seam and a shipyard team answers with steel. February 12th, 1942. Pearl Harbor. Before the sun is fully up, the salvage crews gather in a silence that feels like church, not because anyone is praying out loud, but because everyone knows what they're about to attempt is a kind of resurrection that can't be faked. Joe Martinez stands on a barge deck with a coil of hose at his feet and watches USS Nevada, the battleship that had tried to fight her way out on December 7th before being forced to beach to avoid blocking the channel, sit heavy and wounded, her hull still bearing the indignity of being stranded like a beached whale, and around her the salvage plan looks like a spiderweb of practical desperation, patching damaged areas, sealing openings that shouldn't exist, running pump hoses thick as a man's arm into compartments that have been drowned for 2 months, and clearing the harbor's own scars so a ship can move again. The divers go down first, as they always do, because nothing happens until someone in the black water confirms the ship can hold a seal. They feel along torn plating, check patch edges, tighten bolts by touch, and then, at the signal, pumps begin to throb, steady and relentless, pulling seawater out of steel lungs while compressed air and careful valve control keep the ship from taking water somewhere else in retaliation. Minutes stretch into hours. Men's faces stay blank because optimism is dangerous in salvage, and the only thing that matters is whether the waterline changes by inches you can measure. Then it happens. A subtle lift, almost embarrassing in its smallness. A shift in the ship's posture that makes the crewmen glance at each other as if asking permission to believe. Nevada begins to rise, not like a movie ship bursting from the sea, but like a tired animal pushing itself upright one muscle at a time. And when her lines strain and her hull finally floats again, there's no cheering at first, only exhalation. Because everyone knows floating is only step one, and one wrong seal can undo everything in a minute. Yet that day becomes a hinge in the harbor's mood. A sunk battleship has proven it can move. The Navy Yard responds like an organism that suddenly remembers it has strength, and the salvage tempo accelerates into something close to industrial fury. Teams working virtually around the clock to get damaged or sunken ships back into the fleet. A quiet engineering counterattack that will see many of the December casualties refloated by mid-1942. Now the harbor's biggest work shifts toward the hulks that look even less willing to return. USS California, low in the water, and USS West Virginia, settled into mud, their interiors poisoned by oil and silt, their systems corroding while the war in the Pacific is already burning outward. By March 30th, salvage on California reaches its own breath moment. Cofferdams, temporary watertight enclosures, cling along her port bow, and the ship is under refloating operations as pumps and patchwork fight the sea compartment by compartment, men rebuilding buoyancy the way surgeons rebuild a body with stitches and clamps. Joe watches how the work never looks heroic up close. It looks like mud, like men slipping on oily decks, like welders cutting and sealing in cramped heat, like divers surfacing with blackened faces and hollow eyes, like electricians running temporary power through spaces that still smell faintly of smoke. The real enemy is time. Every day water stays inside a hull. It degrades what can't be replaced quickly. Motors, switchboards, wiring runs. So the salvage division learns to prioritize ruthlessly and improvise constantly, turning barges into machine shops and pier edges into assembly lines for patch plates, gaskets, and bracing. And then comes USS West Virginia, the job men speak about with the low tone reserved for something dangerous and proud. She took multiple torpedo hits, burned, sank in shallow water, and now has to be made whole enough to lift without tearing herself apart. In the weeks leading to spring, divers patch the torpedo holes, shipfitters brace weakened structure, and the pumps never stop. It becomes a war of incremental victories. One watertight boundary regained, one compartment pumped down, one valve finally shut that had been stuck in corrosion like a clenched fist. When West Virginia is finally refloated on May 17, 1942, the moment carries a different weight than Nevada's, because it isn't just a ship rising, it's the harbor proving it can pull something brutal and heavy out of the mud. The ship is taken into Pearl Harbor's dry dock number 1 on June 9th for inspection, and the inspection turns the salvage triumph into something sickeningly human. As temporary repairs progress, men discover the remains of sailors trapped below decks when the ship sank. Some who may have survived for days in air pockets before oxygen and supplies ran out, reminding everyone that salvage is always half engineering, half recovery, and the steel you're saving is still wrapped around lives that ended in darkness. Joe watches older shipyard hands grow quiet around those discoveries, then turn back to work anyway, because the war does not pause for grief, and because every hour counts if these ships are to return to combat power faster than Japan expects. By now, the refloating dates have started to sound like a timetable of defiance. Nevada refloated in February, California under refloating operations in March, West Virginia refloated in May, and other damaged vessels, like the Minelayer Oglala, pulled back from the harbor's bottom through the summer, each one another piece of the fleet reclaimed from the enemy's assumptions. The salvage crews don't talk about miracles. They talk about patches holding, about pumps not failing, about cofferdams not leaking, about keeping men alive in poisoned compartments and not letting fire or fumes finish what bombs began. Yet standing on a barge in the early morning light, watching a battleship's freeboard slowly return, Joe feels the impossible made visible. The United States is not merely replacing ships with new construction, it is dragging dead steel back into the war by force of skill, endurance, and refusal. And as those recovered hulls begin their next journeys, temporary repairs leading to major reconstruction yards, Pearl Harbor's story shifts from catastrophe to counterstroke, because each refloated ship is a message sent without radio. You can strike us, you can sink us, but you can't count us out while our divers are still willing to climb into black water and make a harbor breathe again. June 9th, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Dry Dock. Number 1. Heat shimmers off concrete walls, the air tastes of rust and hot cutting oil, and the sound inside the dock is a constant industrial roar. Compressors chugging, rivet guns rattling, arc welders hissing like angry snakes, and the deep, hollow echo of men working inside a steel giant that has been drained of the sea but not of its scars. Joe Martinez stands on a catwalk and looks down at USS West Virginia as she settles onto keel blocks, water still dripping from seams and drain holes, her hull exposed in a way battleships were never meant to be exposed, naked, battered, and honest. The dock crew moves fast because the war doesn't pause for repairs. Every day a ship sits immobile is a day the fleet fights with fewer guns and fewer decks. Commander Wallin's salvage work has delivered the ship to this place, but now a different kind of miracle has to happen, turning a refloated wreck into a vessel that can cross an ocean to a mainland yard for full reconstruction without breaking apart or flooding again. The first hours are inspection. An inspection feels like confession. Ship fitters crawl over torpedo blister damage, trace fractures along frames, measure where plating has buckled, and mark sections that must be cut away and replaced before the ship can be trusted. Down in the shadows under the ship, workers in hard hats and goggles grind old metal clean, the sparks falling like white rain onto wet concrete. Every cut line is planned with a kind of grim respect because you don't repair a torpedo hole. You rebuild the structure that was supposed to carry the entire ship's strength. Inside, teams tear into compartments that have been drowned for months, and the smell hits first: stale oil, rot, wet insulation, and that metallic tang of seawater that has lived too long inside machinery. Men pull out sodden cables that come away in black, swollen ropes. They strip switchboards that look like corroded skeletons, and they tag anything salvageable like triage in a hospital. It isn't just metal. It's evidence of what water does to a warship when it is given time. Lubricating oil turned to sludge, electrical contact points eaten away, pumps seized by silt, valves frozen in place as if the ship's own body tried to lock itself shut. The work is relentless and emotionally uneven. Some moments feel like pure engineering, others feel like recovery, because the ship still holds the last day of the attack inside her. A hatch that finally opens might reveal nothing but mud and debris, or it might reveal something a sailor never wants to see. And the men who do this work learn to swallow hard and keep moving because there are schedules and because the war demands it. Joe hears the dry dock foreman shouting time targets the way a combat officer shouts, ranges. Patch this, plate that, test these pumps, reroute those lines. The language is different, but the urgency is the same. And all the while,
Pearl Harbor is still a base under threat, still a place where air raid alarms can cut through the noise and remind everyone that the enemy is not a memory. The Pacific is active, and everyone knows Japan expects these ships to be out of the fight for years, if not forever. That expectation becomes fuel. Across the yard, USS California, refloated in March and moving through her own brutal cleaning and stabilization, waits in a different stage of resurrection, and the yard treats her like a second patient in the same operating room. Keep corrosion from winning, rebuild watertight integrity, restore basic power and pumping, and prepare her for the long trip to a major shipyard where a true rebuild can happen.
USS Nevada, already proven capable of floating again, becomes a symbol around the yard, not in speeches, but in the way men point at her and say, "If we got her moving, we can get the others moving." The dry docks and repair berths turn into a conveyor belt of quiet defiance. Refloat, dock, strip, patch, test, move, and repeat. The impossible here is not one breathtaking lift, it's sustaining a tempo of complex technical work with damaged infrastructure, limited parts, exhausted men, and constant pressure from the war's calendar. Every day brings a new problem that can't be solved by bravery, only by method. A temporary patch that held at rest might leak under stress, so teams stage flooding tests and pump trials. A valve that seems shut might fail under pressure changes, so they install redundant closures. A cable run might short once power is applied, so electricians rebuild entire circuits, like nerves in a damaged body. Men do this while sweating through their shirts, while breathing smoke from welding and grit from grinding, while eating quickly, because lunch is just the period when the machines get quieter for a moment.
Joe watches divers still working even with ships in dry dock, because many spaces remain flooded pockets and inaccessible voids. They crawl into angled compartments and pump out mud. They recover tools lost weeks earlier. They guide patch plates from inside, while welders seal from outside, and they come out looking older than they did when they went in. What surprises Joe most is the way the yard begins to feel like a front line of its own, a place where morale rises and falls on whether a pump holds, whether a seal stays dry, whether a ship can take water again without dying. When a major system finally powers up, lights flickering on in a compartment that has been dark since December, men pause as if listening to a heartbeat return. When a test pump clears water from a stubborn space and the level finally drops, men grin without realizing they're grinning. Then an alarm sounds one afternoon, sharp, urgent, and everyone's head tilts toward the sky. Work slows for a second, then resumes because the yard has learned the only way to answer fear is to keep building.
Wallen's presence moves through the yard like a quiet current. He doesn't need to shout. His teams are doing something Japan didn't plan for, turning sunk battleships into moving hulls again, not in years, but in months. And that changes the shape of the future because it means American combat power is not only coming from new construction, it's being reclaimed from mud and oil. By the end of June, West Virginia is no longer a drowned hulk. She is a wounded ship with a route forward, stabilized enough to be sent onward for rebuilding. The yard crews know the ship won't return to battle tomorrow, but that's not the point. The point is that she has been stolen back from the bottom, from the enemy's math, and from the harbor's grief, and now she belongs to time again. Joe stands at the dock edge and watches workers bolt on the last temporary plates and tighten the final bracing, and he understands something that no battle map can show. The Salvage victory isn't quiet because it's small. It's quiet because it's made of thousands of unglamorous decisions that have to be right, and because the men making them are fighting a war against physics and corrosion, while everyone else fights a war against fleets. April 22nd, 1942. Pearl Harbor. There's a particular sound a ship makes when it is no longer a wreck, but a vessel again. Not the clang of repair work, but the deep, steady cadence of engines turning over with purpose, and Joe Martinez hears it from the pier before he sees it. a low vibration traveling through dock timbers as USS Nevada, patched, stabilized, and refloated after the attack, prepares to leave Hawaii under her own power, a battleship that Japan assumed was finished now being nudged back into the war's bloodstream. She doesn't look repaired in the clean sense. She looks like a patient released from surgery with bandages still visible. Patch plates and temporary closures, areas of scarred structure, fresh paint that doesn't match the old. But she floats, she answers her helm, and that is the impossible made practical. Joe watches the yard hands and salvage men line the pier, not cheering, not celebrating, just watching with a quiet intensity that feels more intimate than applause, because they know every mile Nevada steams is a test of their work. Will a temporary patch hold under ocean swell? Will a seam start weeping? Will a repaired valve fail at the wrong moment? The Pacific doesn't care about human effort, and the war doesn't offer second chances. Nevada eases outward, escorted and cautious, and as her wake spreads, Joe realizes the harbor's mood changes in a way no speech could manage. If one sunk battleship can sail out, then Pearl Harbor is no longer a graveyard. It's a factory floor under siege, turning wrecks into assets. Weeks later, the pattern repeats, harder and heavier. USS West Virginia, floated on May 17th and docked on June 9th for inspection and temporary repair, moves through the same brutal pipeline of stabilization, her survival owed to patching torpedo holes, relentless pumping, and the careful rebuilding of watertight boundaries that water and fire tried to erase. Inside her, men work in compartments that still carry the attack like a smell, and discoveries during the repair period, human remains of sailors trapped below decks, remind everyone that these ships are not just steel objects. They are sealed histories that salvage men have to reopen with their hands. Yet the yard keeps moving, because the war is moving, and each ship that becomes seaworthy enough to leave is one less victory Japan can count on. By spring, USS California has already demonstrated how fragile success can be. After being refloated in late March, an accidental explosion on April 5th floods her again and forces salvage teams to repatch and pump her out once more, as if the sea is trying to reclaim what the men have stolen from it. Joe remembers the day the explosion news passed through the yard. Men didn't shout, they just walked faster, because losing tempo is how you lose a ship. And when California finally enters dry dock number 2 on April 9th, it feels like the yard has dragged a second battleship onto the operating table and refuses to let it slip back into the mud. Summer turns into fall, and the harbor's daily soundtrack becomes a relentless argument against December 7th. Compressors, welders, pumps, test drills, and the constant movement of men who live in oil-stained coveralls and sleep in fragments. Then October 10th, 1942 arrives with a moment that looks almost peaceful if you don't know what it cost. USS California, resurrected enough to travel, departs Pearl Harbor for Puget Sound, leaving behind the harbor that once held her down, heading for permanent repair and modernization, as if she's refusing to remember she was ever sunk. On the pier, Joe watches her stern pass and feels a strange mix of pride and fear, because sending a damaged ship across open water is a gamble the Japanese never expected the US Navy to take so soon. It's not just repair, it's tempo. Restore combat power faster than the enemy's assumptions, even if the ship still carries scars under fresh paint. And Pearl Harbor keeps proving that tempo isn't only for battleships. The yard salvages what can be reused, strips what can't be saved, and turns wreckage into resources. Machinery recovered, guns restored, systems rebuilt, because salvage is as much about restoring a fleet's muscle as it is about floating hulls. Beyond the battleships, the yard wrestles with its most dramatic symbol of impossible still lying belly up in the harbor. USS Oklahoma, capsized and blocking navigation like a massive accusation. By early 1942, it is clear she is a hazard and a challenge, and the salvage effort begins in earnest on July 15, 1942. A project so immense it feels less like ship repair and more like engineering warfare. Cables, winches, air forced into interior chambers, coral fill placed to control sliding, and a par-buckling plan that will eventually roll the hull upright between March 8th and June 16th, 1943, using synchronized winches anchored ashore to drag a battleship back from an unnatural posture. Joe doesn't see the ending yet. No one in 1942 does, but he sees the beginnings. Survey teams measuring, divers planning access points, men talking about righting a ship as if it's simply a bigger version of patching a hole, and that attitude, treat the impossible as a sequence of solvable steps, is what turns Pearl Harbor's salvage into a quiet strategic weapon. This is the true reversal that Japan missed when it counted ships sunk on December 7th. A sunk ship isn't necessarily removed from the war, it's placed onto a different kind of battlefield, where divers in black water and ship fitters in dry docks fight physics, corrosion, and time, and if they win, the fleet doesn't just recover, it returns with teeth. By the end of October 1942, as California disappears over the horizon and other patched hulls follow the same path toward mainland yards, Joe understands the new truth of the harbor. Pearl Harbor didn't just survive the attack. It learned how to undo it. One patch plate, one pump line, one refloated keel at a time, until sunk stops sounding final and starts sounding temporary.
March 8th, 1943. Ford Island, Pearl Harbor. Before sunrise, the air is cool and damp, and the harbor looks deceptively calm, but the shoreline is bristling with machinery like a siege line. Winch houses anchored to concrete, heavy cables stretched taut across the water, and rows of steel, dead men, and bollards that look like they were built to restrain a giant. Joe Martinez stands among shipyard hands and Navy officers as USS Oklahoma, still capsized after 15 months, her red bottom stained by salt and time, waits like an accusation that never stopped floating. Today isn't a refloat, not in the ordinary sense. Today is a roll, a controlled violence called par-buckling, and the men around Joe talk in the language of angles and loads because if you talk in the language of hope, you'll get someone killed. The plan feels insane when you say it out loud. Rotate a 27,000-ton battleship back toward upright by pulling her with synchronized winches inch by inch, while compressed air is forced into interior spaces to increase buoyancy and coral fill is used to control sliding so the hull doesn't lurch unpredictably. It's not one pull, it's hundreds of small pulls, each one followed by measurements, tension checks, divers' reports, and the constant fear that a cable could snap and whip across the harbor like a scythe.
The first movement is so slight some men think they imagined it. The hull's edge rises a fraction, water burbles and gurgles from openings that were never designed to be up, and the ship makes a deep, groaning sound as if the steel itself is protesting this unnatural correction. Joe watches the cable lines tremble and feels a strange empathy for the wreck. Oklahoma isn't just heavy. She's full of mud, flooded spaces, twisted internal structure, and the dead weight of everything the attack did to her in minutes, and the harbor did to her in months. Divers go down repeatedly, not to fix her, there is no fixing her in a clean way, but to confirm that key points are behaving, that she isn't sliding the wrong direction, that internal pockets aren't suddenly releasing air, that the hull isn't tearing where it shouldn't, that nothing inside is shifting into a new catastrophe. Up top, the salvage engineers run the operation like a slow-motion battle drill. Winches haul, pause, hold, measurements taken, tension adjusted, another haul, another pause. Every iteration is a negotiation with physics. The ship rotates a little more, and the harbor responds with new problems. Oil that had been trapped begins to seep, debris rises, and the water around the hull churns with a foul rainbow sheen that reminds everyone of December 7th's first hours. Men gag and keep working because disgust is a luxury and time is still the enemy. The work lasts through weeks, and the psychological strain becomes its own weight. The men on the winches know one mistake can kill their friends. The divers know the spaces inside that wreck are still lethal, full of jagged metal and trapped gases and darkness that swallows light. The supervisors know the whole world is watching. not with cameras but with arithmetic, because every day the harbor stays cluttered by a capsized battleship is a day operations are constrained, and every day the Navy proves it can undo. Pearl Harbor is a day Japan's assumptions rot. By late March, Oklahoma has rotated enough that her silhouette begins to look less like a dead animal and more like a ship again. And that shift in outline does something to morale that no victory bulletin can match. Men who never smile in the yard catch themselves staring because they are watching an idea become real. Sunk does not mean gone, not if you have winches, divers, engineers, and a refusal to accept a headline as permanent. The rolling continues into April and May, and each stage is harder, because the closer the ship comes to upright, the more forces change, the more weight shifts, the more the salvage team must recalibrate everything, cable tension, buoyancy, grounding points, so the hull doesn't slam into a position that will tear her open. Joe learns that salvage isn't just strength, it's patience weaponized. Sometimes the operation stops for days, not because men are afraid, but because smart men know when the harbor is demanding a pause, weather, equipment strain, unexpected internal issues, and the discipline to stop is as important as the courage to start. Finally, in June 1943, after months of incremental rotation, Oklahoma is brought upright, still a ruin, still flooded, still scarred beyond simple repair, but upright, moved out of her humiliating posture and returned to a form that the Navy can manage, strip, and eventually remove. The sight hits Joe like a closing chapter. The most visible symbol of Pearl Harbor's helplessness has been forced to change shape, not by bombs or guns, but by cables and mathematics, and men willing to keep pulling when the steel groaned back at them. And that is the quiet, strategic truth of the salvage war. These crews didn't just refloat ships, they restored tempo, cleared channels, preserved what could be rebuilt, and returned hulls to the pipeline that fed combat power. Nevada, leaving under her own power, California heading to mainland yards, West Virginia stabilized and rebuilt for a later return, each one a denial of Japan's expectation that the Pacific Fleet would be crippled for years. When Joe walks the pier afterward, he hears the yard the way he's come to hear it since December. The hiss of welding, the thump of pumps, the clatter of tools. Sounds that now mean something larger than repair. They mean that Pearl Harbor's second battle was fought in oil and mud and twisted steel, and the men who fought it proved the impossible doesn't arrive as a miracle. It arrives as 1,000 small decisions made correctly under pressure until a sunk ship is no longer a wreck, but a weapon again. December 28th, 1943. Pearl Harbor, Dry Dock Number 2. Rain spits against the dock walls and runs down concrete in thin gray sheets as tugs ease USS Oklahoma, finally upright after the par-buckling operation that began on March 8th and was completed on June 16th, into the dry dock like a defeated giant being guided to a table it never wanted to lie on. Joe Martinez, older now and harder around the eyes, watches from the dock edge as the water drains away and reveals a hull that looks less like a ship than a long, scarred container for grief and salvage math. Because after writing her, teams had placed cofferdams around the wreck to undertake basic repairs and make her watertight enough for this moment. And now the Navy's goal is no longer return her to battle, but strip her. Guns, machinery, stores, save what can be saved, and admit, with a kind of sober mercy, that some steel is too old and too broken to justify another resurrection. The yard moves with the same ruthless tempo it learned in 1942. Cranes swing, cutting torches hiss, chains clank, and the ship is dismantled methodically, not as an insult, but as a resource extraction that feeds the war effort elsewhere. Even the impossible has its limits, and acknowledging those limits is part of how the Navy wins, by spending time and labor where it returns fighting strength fastest. Yet just beyond this dock, the real miracle of Pearl Harbor salvage is already in motion on the mainland, because the ships that could be saved were not merely patched and floated, they were sent into a second, deeper transformation. Joe has seen the departure dates become like heartbeat ticks in his memory. Nevada refloated on February 12, 1942, temporarily repaired and finished at Pearl Harbor on April 22nd before steaming to Puget Sound for major overhaul. By October 1942, she was rebuilt enough to re-enter service, and in May 1943, she was firing her big guns in the Aleutians during the Attu operation, a battleship Japan had helped sink, now throwing shells into enemy-held rock and tundra. California, refloated on March 25, 1942, knocked back by the accidental explosion on April 5th that flooded her again, then dragged into dry dock number 2 on April 9th and stabilized, finally departed Pearl Harbor on October 10th, 1942, for Puget Sound, to be rebuilt into something tougher and more modern than the ship that had gone down on Battleship Row. And West Virginia, refloated on May 17, 1942, dry docked June 9th, then sent to Puget Sound for reconstruction, becomes the yard's most profound symbol. She doesn't just get repaired, she gets rewritten. Her old silhouette replaced with a new superstructure, heavier anti-aircraft batteries, and the radar sets that are changing naval war the way steel and oil changed it a generation earlier. In Bremerton, workers crawl through gutted spaces with flashlights and chalk marks, cutting out corroded runs, installing new systems, building torpedo bulges, reinforcing decks, and fitting directors and antennas that will let a battleship see and shoot at night. Work so extensive that the ship's identity feels altered, and when Joe visits the yard later, he barely recognizes her lines. She looks less like the Pearl Harbor wreck and more like a rebuilt weapon, a battleship designed for a war that now lives in aircraft, radar scopes, and anti-aircraft fire curtains. The summer of 1944 is when this long, silent engineering campaign finally begins to pay back in a way even the most cynical sailor can't ignore. By early July, West Virginia is conducting post-refit readiness work and returning toward active duty. NHHC notes she rejoined the active fleet in July 1944. And the fact lands like a punchline to Japan's December 1941 assumptions. The ship that sank in shallow water, the ship men thought would be a permanent memorial, is moving again as a modernized combatant. Joe imagines what it must feel like on her decks during those first sea trials off the Washington coast. Salt wind cutting across newly built platforms, the strange quiet of an engine room that has been rebuilt, gun crews drilling under new directors, radar operators staring at green glowing screens that turn darkness into range and bearing. And he understands that Salvage did not end when the hull floated. Salvage only handed the ship to the next set of hands, and those hands turned survival into advantage. In Pearl Harbor, the yard keeps absorbing the echoes of that advantage. Every report of a rebuilt battleship returning to the line makes the men on the dock stand a little straighter, because it proves their filth and mudwork mattered beyond the harbor walls. It wasn't just recovery, it was force generation. Even Oklahoma, stripped and ultimately judged too old and too heavily damaged to return to service, still contributes in a colder way, by yielding salvageable machinery and steel, and by clearing the harbor of the most visible scar of December 7th. And so the Pearl Harbor story keeps unfolding in real time, not as a single dramatic comeback, but as a conveyor belt of engineering victories. Patch, pump, dock, rebuild, modernize, sail, until sunk stops meaning removed from the war and starts meaning delayed. And as the rebuilt ships steam outward toward the Pacific again, the men who once waded through oil and climbed into black water realize the quiet truth they've been living since the morning after the raid. The attack tried to end the fleet in one day, but the salvage crews stretched that day into a long fight the enemy didn't plan for. A fight where steel comes back to life, one welded seam at a time, and where the real revenge is measured not in speeches, but in the wake of a ship that was supposed to be dead. October 24th, 1944, Surigao Strait, Philippines. Night presses down heavy and humid, the kind of darkness that feels alive, and the sea is so black it swallows the horizon. On the bridge of USS West Virginia, Captain Charles R. Kelly stands under red lights, while radar scopes glow in the plotting spaces behind him, turning invisible water into crisp lines and blips. And for a moment, just a moment, Joe Martinez's Pearl Harbor memories feel like a different lifetime. Mud, oil, patch plates, the sound of pumps, the smell of drowned compartments. Now the ship is steel and light and readiness, rebuilt and modernized, back in the line where battleships are supposed to be, and the irony is almost painful. A ship Japan helped sink in December 1941 has returned in time for one of the last and most decisive surface battles of the Pacific War. In the strait ahead, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line is forming a classic trap, battleships and cruisers positioned to cross the T of the approaching Japanese southern force, and West Virginia is among them, one of the resurrected Pearl Harbor battleships that now carries new fire control and radar capability, able to track targets in darkness with a precision unimaginable to her crew in 1941. The ship's big guns are loaded, crews quiet at their stations, and every man knows what the order will sound like when it comes. Open fire. The sea is not empty. Japanese ships are pushing north through the narrow waterway, believing they can break into Leyte Gulf. The Americans have built a barricade, and for West Virginia there is a deeper, quieter emotion in the air. This is not just combat, it is return. On the plotting table, Rangers fall steadily as radar tracks stabilize. The captain listens to the calm voices of his radar and fire control teams. Measured, professional, almost detached, because the ship has been rebuilt into a weapon of systems, and systems demand cool voices. When the firing order comes, it is crisp, and the first broadside is like the harbor itself cracking open. 9 16-inch guns erupt, the muzzle blast slamming into the night, flame briefly illuminating the ship's superstructure and the focused faces of men who have drilled for this moment since the refit. The concussion rolls across the water and comes back as echo off distant shoreline. And for anyone who knew the ship as a drowned hulk, the sound is almost spiritual, proof that Salvage didn't just save steel, it restored killing power. Salvo after salvo follows, each one guided by radar solutions that keep tightening as the Japanese force is hammered. The battle line is doing exactly what Oldendorf designed, and West Virginia is one of the ships that can see best in the dark, landing accurate fire early and often, her guns contributing to the destruction and crippling of the enemy in a strait that becomes a corridor of explosions and burning ships. The men in the turrets feel only the violent rhythm of loading and firing. The men on the bridge feel the ship's whole body shudder. The men in plotting feel the cold satisfaction of tracked blips turning into hits. And through it all, the ship carries the ghost of December 7th as a kind of fuel, because the Pacific War has always been personal for the ships that survived that morning. In the blackness outside the strait, destroyers slash torpedoes into the Japanese column. Cruisers rake targets, searchlights stab at smoke, and the sea itself seems to burn. West Virginia keeps firing until orders shift, and the Japanese force collapses, and the ship's officers watch radar returns vanish or slow into wreckage. In the aftermath, as dawn begins to grey the horizon, the battle line holds, and the realization settles in with an almost unbearable clarity. One of the sunk Pearl Harbor ships has not just returned to war, it has returned to deliver decisive fire in a battle that helped seal Japan's fate in the Philippines campaign. For Joe Martinez, even if he is not physically on West Virginia that night, the scene exists in his mind as the completion of a story he helped begin in Blackwater. The diver's lifeline, the patch plate tightened by touch, the pump line that finally held, the long months of dockyard surgery, the rebuilding into a modernized ship, and now the muzzle flash lighting the night over Surigao Strait. That is the impossible made visible at the far end of the salvage pipeline. You don't just refloat a ship, you return it to a moment where it can change a battle. Back in Pearl Harbor, the men who once worked under oil slicks would read about Surigao and understand something the headlines might miss. The Navy didn't merely replace what was lost on December 7th. It reclaimed it, upgraded it, and sent it back into the fight in time to matter. And that is why the salvage crew's victory is quiet only in its beginning. Its ending is written in the thunder of 16-inch guns firing in darkness guided by radar from a ship that was once sunk in mud. And that thunder is the harbor speaking back, years later, in the only language war truly understands. October 24th, 1944. Surigao Strait, Philippines. Night presses down heavy and humid, the kind of darkness that feels alive, and the sea is so black it swallows the horizon. On the bridge of USS West Virginia, Captain Charles R. Kelly stands under red lights while radar scopes glow in the plotting spaces behind him, turning invisible water into crisp lines and blips. And for a moment, just a moment, Joe Martinez's Pearl Harbor memories feel like a different lifetime. Mud, oil, patch plates, the sound of pumps, the smell of drowned compartments. Now the ship is steel and light and readiness, rebuilt and modernized, back in the line where battleships are supposed to be, and the irony is almost painful. A ship Japan helped sink in December 1941 has returned in time for one of the last and most decisive surface battles of the Pacific War. In the strait ahead, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line is forming a classic trap. Battleships and cruisers positioned to cross the T of the approaching Japanese Southern Force, and West Virginia is among them, one of the resurrected Pearl Harbor battleships that now carries new fire control and radar capability, able to track targets in darkness with a precision unimaginable to her crew in 1941. The ship's big guns are loaded, crews quiet at their stations, and every man knows what the order will sound like when it comes. Open fire. The sea is not empty. Japanese ships are pushing north through the narrow waterway, believing they can break into Leyte Gulf. The Americans have built a barricade, and for West Virginia, there is a deeper, quieter emotion in the air. This is not just combat, it is return. On the plotting table, ranges fall steadily as radar tracks stabilize. The captain listens to the calm voices of his radar and fire control teams. Measured, professional, almost detached, because the ship has been rebuilt into a weapon of systems, and systems demand cool voices. When the firing order comes, it is crisp, and the first broadside is like the harbor itself cracking open. 9 16-inch guns erupt, the muzzle blast slamming into the night, flame briefly illuminating the ship's superstructure and the focused faces of men who have drilled for this moment since the refit. The concussion rolls across the water and comes back as echo off distant shoreline. And for anyone who knew the ship as a drowned hulk, the sound is almost spiritual, proof that Salvage didn't just save steel, it restored killing power. Salvo after salvo follows, each one guided by radar solutions that keep tightening as the Japanese force is hammered. The battle line is doing exactly what Oldendorf designed, and West Virginia is one of the ships that can see best in the dark, landing accurate fire early and often, her guns contributing to the destruction and crippling of the enemy in a strait that becomes a corridor of explosions and burning ships. The men in the turrets feel only the violent rhythm of loading and firing. The men on the bridge feel the ship's whole body shudder. The men in plotting feel the cold satisfaction of tracked blips turning into hits. And through it all, the ship carries the ghost of December 7th as a kind of fuel. Because the Pacific War has always been personal for the ships that survived that morning. In the blackness outside the strait, destroyers slash torpedoes into the Japanese column, cruisers rake targets, searchlights stab at smoke, and the sea itself seems to burn. West Virginia keeps firing until orders shift and the Japanese force collapses, and the ship's officers watch radar returns vanish or slow into wreckage. In the aftermath, as dawn begins to grey the horizon, the battle line holds, and the realization settles in with an almost unbearable clarity. One of the sunk Pearl Harbor ships has not just returned to war, it has returned to deliver decisive fire in a battle that helped seal Japan's fate in the Philippines campaign. For Joe Martinez, even if he is not physically on West Virginia that night, the scene exists in his mind as the completion of a story he helped begin in Blackwater. The diver's lifeline, the patch plate tightened by touch, the pump line that finally held, the long months of dockyard surgery, the rebuilding into a modernized ship, and now the muzzle flash lighting the night over Surigao Strait. That is the impossible made visible at the far end of the salvage pipeline. You don't just refloat a ship, you return it to a moment where it can change a battle. Back in Pearl Harbor, the men who once worked under oil slicks would read about Surigao and understand something the headlines might miss. The Navy didn't merely replace what was lost on December 7th, it reclaimed it, upgraded it, and sent it back into the fight in time to matter. And that is why the salvage crew's victory is quiet only in its beginning. Its ending is written in the thunder of 16-inch guns firing in darkness, guided by radar from a ship that was once sunk in mud. And that thunder is the harbor speaking back, years later, in the only language war truly understands.